Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial, disturbing, and potentially world-changing stories to ever emerge from the decades of conflict in Afghanistan. What you're about to hear over the next 40 minutes comes from multiple credible sources, including Special Operations Forces, infantry soldiers, drone operators, intelligence analysts, and other military personnel who witnessed something that, according to mainstream science and our understanding of the world, simply should not exist. These are detailed accounts of giant humanoid creatures, standing anywhere from 8 to 13 feet tall, lurking in the remote mountain ranges of Afghanistan. These are stories that have been systematically suppressed, officially denied, and hidden behind layers of military secrecy and non-disclosure agreements. Whether you choose to believe these accounts or dismiss them as elaborate fabrications, the consistency of the testimonies, the credibility of the sources, the corroboration across different time periods and geographic locations, and the connections to ancient historical and religious texts make this a story absolutely worth examining in detail. So settle in, because we're going to explore every aspect of this phenomenon, from the initial shocking encounter to the broader implications of what these testimonies might mean for our understanding of human history, evolution, and the hidden corners of our world that remain unexplored. Before we dive into the specific incidents, we need to understand the context of Afghanistan itself. This nation has earned a grim and well-deserved reputation throughout recorded history as the graveyard of empires. This isn't just a dramatic nickname. It's a historical pattern that has repeated itself with remarkable consistency over more than 2,000 years. From Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, whose armies struggled through these mountains and whose generals reportedly encountered strange creatures in the remote regions, to the British Empire in the 19th century, which suffered catastrophic defeats in multiple Anglo-Afghan wars, to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, which poured resources and tens of thousands of troops into the country only to withdraw in defeat after 10 years of brutal conflict, to the modern coalition forces led by the United States, which spent 20 years and trillions of dollars attempting to stabilize the region before ultimately withdrawing in 2021. No superpower, regardless of its military might, technological superiority, or strategic genius, has successfully conquered, occupied, or fully controlled Afghanistan. The question that historians and military strategists have asked for generations is, why? What makes this particular nation so impossible to subdue? The standard answer focuses on the fierce independence of the Afghan people, the tribal structure of society that resists centralized control, and most importantly, the geography itself. The landscape of Afghanistan is absolutely brutal from a military perspective. Vast mountain ranges, including the Hindu Kush, which stretches over 600 miles across the country, dominate the terrain. These aren't gentle rolling hills. These are some of the most rugged, treacherous, and unforgiving mountains on Earth. Peaks soar above 20,000 feet. Valleys plunge thousands of feet below. The terrain is a maze of narrow passes, hidden ravines, steep cliffs, and countless caves. Some of these cave systems are natural formations that extend for miles underground, creating a subterranean world that has never been fully mapped or explored. For centuries, these mountains have provided perfect hiding places for anyone who knows how to use them. Resistance fighters can disappear into valleys that take days to reach on foot. Entire villages exist in areas so remote that they remain virtually untouched by the outside world. Cave systems provide shelter from aerial surveillance, protection from harsh weather, and defensible positions against any attacking force. During the Soviet occupation, entire battalions of Mujahideen fighters would vanish into these mountains, only to emerge weeks later to launch devastating attacks before disappearing again. When coalition forces, including American, British, Canadian, Australian, and other NATO troops deployed to Afghanistan following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, they expected to face determined but ultimately conventional resistance from Taliban fighters and al-Qaeda operatives. Military planners studied the Soviet experience, learned from their mistakes, and deployed with advanced technology, including satellite surveillance, thermal imaging, drone reconnaissance, night vision equipment, and communication systems that should have provided overwhelming tactical advantages. What they didn't expect, what no amount of planning or technology could prepare them for, was the possibility that these ancient mountains might hide creatures that most educated people in the 21st century believe only exist in mythology, folklore, and ancient religious texts. The terrain itself presented enormous challenges that even modern technology couldn't fully overcome. Satellite imagery could identify major geographic features and potentially large groups of people, but it couldn't penetrate into the countless caves. Thermal imaging worked well in open terrain but was useless when trying to detect anything deep inside mountain cave systems. The sheer vastness of the landscape meant that even with thousands of troops and hundreds of aerial assets, huge portions of Afghanistan remained essentially unexplored and unmonitored. Intelligence reports from the early years of the conflict noted something unusual. Local populations in certain remote regions exhibited strange behaviors that didn't fit typical patterns. Some villages that showed no signs of supporting the Taliban and had no apparent reason to be hostile would nevertheless refuse any interaction with coalition forces, sometimes abandoning their homes entirely when patrols approached. Other villages maintained unusual traditions that seemed to have no practical purpose, such as leaving offerings of food and died animals in specific locations far from any settlements. When questioned, local elders would become evasive or hostile, refusing to explain these practices. Some interpreters working with coalition forces, Afghans who had lived in these regions their entire lives, would occasionally hint at old stories passed down through generations, tales of creatures that lived in the highest mountains, beings that were feared and respected by the local population, entities that should not be disturbed. Most Western personnel dismissed these stories as superstition, the kind of folklore that develops in isolated communities. But a few soldiers, particularly those with experience in anthropology or cultural studies, began to wonder if there might be something more to these persistent legends. Now let's dive into the incident that has become the centerpiece of this entire phenomenon, the event known as the Giant of Kandahar. This encounter allegedly occurred in early 2002, during the initial chaotic months of Operation Enduring Freedom when coalition forces were still establishing control and Taliban and al-Qaeda forces were retreating into remote mountain strongholds. A Special Forces patrol, the exact unit designation remains classified, but sources suggest they were likely Army Rangers or possibly Delta Force operators, was sent into the remote mountains of Kandahar province on what the mission briefing described as a routine reconnaissance patrol. The mission parameters were straightforward. The team was to patrol a specific sector of the mountains, gather intelligence on potential insurgent activity, identify any cave systems that might be used as hideouts, and report back. This was the kind of mission that Special Forces teams conducted dozens of times every week across Afghanistan. The patrol consisted of experienced operators, men who had trained for years and had combat experience in other theaters. They were equipped with state-of-the-art weapons, communication equipment, GPS navigation, and everything else they might need for a several-day patrol in hostile territory. The team departed their forward operating base and made their way into the mountains. For the first day, everything proceeded according to plan. They moved through the rugged terrain, checked several small cave openings that turned out to be empty, and maintained regular radio contact with their command. But on the second day, something went wrong. The scheduled radio check-in never came. Command tried repeatedly to raise the team on multiple frequencies but received no response. This was highly unusual for a Special Forces team, where communication discipline and protocol adherence were absolutely critical. After several hours with no contact, the decision was made to send a second team to locate the missing patrol and determine what had happened. This Quick Reaction Force, or QRF, consisted of additional Special Forces operators who were briefed on the last known location of the missing team and told to prepare for potential hostile contact. The assumption was that the first team had been ambushed by a large Taliban force, possibly taken prisoner or killed, and that their equipment had been destroyed or captured. The second team inserted by helicopter at a safe distance from the last known position of the missing patrol and began moving toward that location on foot. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following the GPS coordinates and planned route of the missing team, they began finding scattered equipment. At first, it was small items: a torn piece of fabric that matched the pattern of American military uniforms, a crushed canteen, a broken piece of communications equipment. The condition of these items was unusual. They weren't just dropped or lost. They appeared to have been violently torn apart with tremendous force. As the search team pressed forward, the trail of destruction became more pronounced and more disturbing. They found larger pieces of military equipment, all of it damaged in ways that didn't make sense. Weapons that appeared to have been bent or broken, metal components that showed signs of incredible crushing force, gear that had been shredded as if by enormous claws or teeth. The team's medic noticed something else that sent chills down his spine. There were traces of blood on some of the equipment, but the blood spatter patterns were completely wrong. Instead of the typical patterns you'd see from gunshot wounds or shrapnel injuries, the blood appeared to have been splattered from a great height, as if someone or something had been lifted high into the air before being torn apart. The team continued following this trail of destruction, moving slowly and carefully, weapons at the ready, every sense on high alert. The terrain was becoming increasingly difficult, with steep rock faces and narrow passages between massive boulders. Finally, they came upon a section of the mountain face that was honeycombed with large cave openings. These weren't small natural crevices. These were substantial caves, some of them with openings 15 or 20 feet high and equally wide. The kind of caves that could shelter dozens of people or hide significant weapon caches. In front of these cave openings, the team made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Large piles of bones were stacked haphazardly near the entrances to the largest caves. Some of the bones were clearly from animals, likely goats, sheep, and other livestock, but others were unmistakably human. Skulls, femurs, rib cages, all showing signs of having been gnawed on and broken open, presumably to extract the marrow. Mixed among these piles of bones were more pieces of military equipment belonging to the missing patrol. Torn uniforms with name tags still visible, crushed helmets, destroyed weapons and personal items, including photographs and letters from home. The implications of what they were seeing were almost too horrific to process. The missing patrol hadn't been killed in a firefight with insurgents. They had been hunted, killed, dragged to this location, and consumed. The team's leader was making the decision to pull back and call for reinforcements when they heard movement from deep within one of the larger caves. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or normal human movement. It was something massive shifting its weight, perhaps awakened by the sounds of the soldiers outside or by their scent carried on the wind into the cave system. For a few seconds that felt like hours, everything was silent except for the wind whistling through the rocks and the rapid breathing of the soldiers as they trained their weapons on the dark cave opening. Then, with a roar that one survivor later described as unlike anything he had ever heard, neither fully human nor purely animal, but somehow both and neither, something emerged from the darkness of that cave entrance. What came charging out of that cave entrance has become the stuff of legend among certain military circles, though officially it never happened, and the men who witnessed it were ordered never to speak of it. A massive humanoid figure, standing at least 13 feet tall by the most conservative estimates, and possibly even taller, came rushing toward the team with shocking speed for something so large. The giant was wearing what appeared to be animal skins, crudely draped over its body, held in place by what looked like twisted leather or sinew cords. Its face, partially visible through the thick beard and long hair, was distinctly humanoid, but distorted, with features that seemed exaggerated and primitive. The brow ridge was pronounced, the jaw massive and powerful, and when it opened its mouth to release another earth-shaking roar, the soldiers could clearly see 2 rows of teeth, one behind the other, all of them large and sharp, perfectly designed for tearing meat from bone. But perhaps the most distinctive and disturbing feature of this creature, The detail that multiple witnesses would later emphasize in their testimonies, despite knowing how it would make them sound, was the hands. Each of the giant's massive hands had 6 fingers, not the 5 that every human being possesses, but 6 perfectly formed digits on each hand. These weren't deformations or mutations. They appeared to be completely functional and natural for this creature. The same was visible on its feet, 6 toes on each foot, which the soldiers glimpsed as the creature moved with a strange gait that was almost but not quite like a human running. The giant wielded a weapon, a massive spear that must have been 12 or 14 feet long, made from what appeared to be a single piece of wood, possibly an entire young tree trunk that had been stripped of branches and sharpened to a vicious point. The tip of the spear appeared to have been hardened in fire, a technique that humans had used in prehistoric times before the development of metal tools. For something of its size and strength, this spear would be a devastatingly effective weapon, capable of piercing through body armor or impaling multiple targets with a single thrust. The team had only seconds to react, as this creature closed the distance between the cave entrance and their position. These were highly trained special operations soldiers, men who had been in countless firefights, who had trained for years to maintain composure and effectiveness under the most stressful combat conditions. But nothing in their training had prepared them for this. For a crucial moment, several members of the team simply froze, their minds unable to process what they were seeing, unable to reconcile the existence of this creature with everything they understood about the world. The team leader, to his credit, maintained his composure enough to shout orders, screaming for his men to open fire, to engage the target, to do something before this creature reached their position. But the giant was already upon them, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The giant's massive spear, wielded with the kind of skill that spoke of years or perhaps generations of practice, shot forward with lightning speed. One of the soldiers, a young specialist who had been to Afghanistan only 3 months, didn't move fast enough. The spear caught him in the center of his chest with such force that it lifted him completely off his feet and drove him backwards several meters before pinning him against a large boulder. The soldier died almost instantly, the massive spear having pierced entirely through his body armor, which was designed to stop rifle rounds, as if it was made of paper. His teammates would later recount the horrific sound of the impact, the crunch of breaking ribs, the wet tearing sound as the spear punched through flesh and bone, and the horrible abbreviated scream that was cut short as the soldier's lungs filled with blood. The death of their teammates seemed to break the paralysis that had gripped the rest of the squad. Years of training took over, and the remaining soldiers opened fire on the giant with everything they had. M4 rifles barked repeatedly, sending streams of 5.55mm rounds into the giant's massive torso. The team's designated marksman, equipped with a larger caliber weapon, was putting round after round into the giant's center mass. The creature staggered under the impact of dozens of bullets, roaring in pain and fury, but it didn't immediately go down. For approximately 30 seconds, which survivors recall feeling like an eternity, the team poured sustained fire into this creature. Hundreds of rounds were expended in those 30 seconds. The giant's body jerked and spasmed with each impact, blood that appeared darker and thicker than human blood, spraying from multiple wound channels. The creature attempted to pull the spear from the dead soldier, perhaps intending to use it again, or simply acting on instinct or rage. But the concentrated fire was too much, even for something of its size and apparent resilience.
Finally, with one last rattling roar that echoed across the mountains, the giant collapsed. Its massive body, which survivors estimated must have weighed at least 1,000 pounds and possibly significantly more, hit the rocky ground with a thunderous impact that they could feel through their boots. Even after it fell, several soldiers continued firing, unable to quite believe that this thing could be stopped, unwilling to take any chance that it might get back up. Only when their magazines ran dry and the ringing echoes of gunfire finally faded did they stop shooting. For several minutes, none of the soldiers moved. They simply stood there, weapons still raised, staring at the enormous corpse lying on the ground in front of them, trying to process what had just happened. Their teammate was dead, killed by a creature that shouldn't exist, impaled on a primitive weapon by something that seemed to have stepped out of prehistoric times or biblical mythology. The team leader finally regained enough composure to call for immediate extraction and medevac, though he struggled to find words to describe what they had encountered. The response from command was initial confusion and disbelief. The team leader repeated his request for immediate extraction and added that they had encountered a hostile entity of unknown type, that they had one KIA, and that they needed additional support immediately. The confusion in command's response was evident even over the radio, but the urgency in the team leader's voice made it clear that this was no joke and no drill. What happened next is perhaps even more extraordinary than the encounter itself, and it provides the strongest evidence that this incident was real and that high-level military officials took it very seriously. The team was told to maintain security around the area and wait for extraction, but instead of a standard medevac helicopter or a Chinook coming to pick them up, what arrived was something else entirely. Within a couple of hours, much faster than would be normal for that remote location, multiple helicopters appeared over the mountains. A Chinook heavy-lift helicopter set down near the cave site, but this wasn't a normal transport. This aircraft appeared to have been specifically configured for cargo transport, with specialized lifting equipment visible. Along with the Chinook came several Black Hawk helicopters carrying what appeared to be special recovery teams. These weren't regular soldiers. They were wearing uniforms with no identifying patches or insignia, and they worked with practiced efficiency that suggested they had done this sort of thing before. The recovery team immediately took control of the scene. The surviving members of the patrol were separated from each other, told to secure the perimeter, and ordered not to discuss what had happened. Other members of the recovery team approached the giant's corpse with what appeared to be specialized equipment, including heavy-duty straps, measuring tools, and cameras. They photographed and measured the body from every angle, documenting everything about this creature's physical characteristics. One of the soldiers from the original patrol, watching from a short distance away, later reported that the measurements he glimpsed suggested the creature was between 12 and 13 feet tall, though it was difficult to be precise given the body's position and the fact that he wasn't allowed anywhere near the actual measuring process. The creature's weight was estimated at approximately 1,100 pounds, though, again, this is based on fragmentary information and observations rather than official measurements. The recovery team used the Chinook's heavy lift equipment to carefully load the giant's body into the cargo bay. This wasn't a quick process. The sheer size and weight of the creature required careful maneuvering and multiple attachment points to lift it safely. During this entire process, the soldiers from the patrol were kept at a distance, though several of them managed to catch additional glimpses of the creature's body. One soldier later described seeing the six-fingered hands more clearly as the body was lifted, noting that each finger had a thick, dark nail that was more like a claw than a human fingernail. Once the body was loaded, the recovery team collected every piece of evidence from the scene. They gathered up the spent shell casings from the firefight, photographed the area extensively, took samples of the blood that had pooled beneath the giant's body, and even collected some of the bones from the piles near the cave entrances. They worked with methodical precision, ensuring that nothing was left behind that might provide evidence of what had occurred. The body of the fallen American soldier was treated with respect, but was handled separately from the giant's corpse. He was placed in a body bag and loaded onto one of the Black Hawks, destined to be returned home with honors, though the true circumstances of his death would be covered up, and his family would be told he had been killed in action against enemy forces, which was technically true but wildly incomplete. For years after this incident, the surviving soldiers largely kept their silence. The NDA, the threats of prosecution, the sheer unbelievability of the story, and the fear of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking all contributed to keeping this story suppressed. But as time passed and some of these soldiers left active duty and transitioned to civilian life, the psychological burden of carrying this secret began to weigh heavily. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which many combat veterans experience, was compounded by the inability to talk honestly about one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives.
Eventually, some of these veterans began to share their stories, initially anonymously on internet forums and websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Later, with increasing specificity as others came forward with corroborating accounts. One former soldier, who used the pseudonym Mr. K in his initial testimonies, provided extensive details about the Kandahar encounter, details that matched information that other witnesses had provided independently, lending credibility to the overall account. When journalists and researchers began investigating the Giant of Kandahar story and submitted Freedom of Information Act requests to the Department of Defense, they were met with predictable denials. Official spokespeople stated unequivocally that no such encounter had ever occurred, that no giant humanoid creatures had been encountered in Afghanistan, and that the entire story was fabrication. They pointed out, correctly, that there were no official records documenting such an incident, no photographs or physical evidence that had been made public, and no corroboration from command-level personnel. But the absence of official documentation proves nothing either way. If such an encounter did occur, and if military and intelligence officials decided to suppress all information about it, then of course there would be no documentation available through normal channels. The entire point of classifying something at the highest levels and making personnel sign NDAs is to ensure that no evidence enters the public domain. But here is where the Giant of Kandahar story becomes significantly more compelling and moves beyond being just a single isolated incident that might be dismissed as misidentification, combat stress, or fabrication. The Kandahar encounter wasn't the only report of giant humanoid creatures in Afghanistan. As awareness of these stories spread, and as more veterans felt emboldened to come forward, a pattern began to emerge of multiple independent sightings across different regions of Afghanistan during different time periods of the conflict by different military personnel who had no connection to each other and in many cases didn't even know that others had reported similar experiences.
One particularly detailed and credible testimony came from an infantry team leader who served in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2009, several years after the Kandahar incident and in a different region of the country. This soldier, who has chosen to remain anonymous for fear of professional repercussions, but who has provided his testimony through intermediaries who vouch for his credibility and military service record, described an encounter that occurred during a nighttime patrol in the mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan. His unit was conducting a movement through difficult terrain under cover of darkness, using night vision equipment and thermal imaging to navigate and watch for potential threats. The team was using an ANPAS-13 thermal weapons sight, which displays heat signatures and is highly effective for detecting people, animals, and vehicles even in complete darkness or through foliage and light cover. This particular soldier was serving as the designated marksman for his team and was using the thermal optic to scan the surrounding terrain for any signs of enemy activity. As he panned his thermal sight across a ridgeline approximately 500 meters from their position, he picked up a heat signature that immediately struck him as wrong. At first, he thought his equipment might be malfunctioning because the signature was far too large to be a person. He lowered the optic and looked at the area with his naked eyes, but could see nothing in the darkness. When he looked through the thermal sight again, the massive heat signature was still there, and it was moving. The figure appeared to be standing near a group of trees that the soldier estimated were approximately 10 to 12 feet tall, based on similar vegetation he had seen during daytime patrols in the area. The heat signature stood as tall as these trees, possibly even slightly taller. This wasn't a person standing on elevated ground or on top of a rock. The figure was clearly standing on the same ground level as the trees and was simply that enormous. What made this sighting particularly compelling was that the soldier was able to observe this creature's behavior for several minutes. He watched as it moved through the area with surprising grace and speed. The way it moved was distinctly bipedal, walking on two legs in a manner similar to a human, but with a longer, more powerful stride that covered ground with remarkable efficiency. In the few minutes he observed it through his thermal optic, he watched this creature traverse terrain that would have taken his entire squad hours to cover, moving easily over obstacles and through difficult ground that would slow a normal human significantly.
The soldier called over his team leader and showed him what he was seeing through the thermal sight. The team leader confirmed the sighting, verifying that both of them were seeing the same massive heat signature moving through the terrain. They discussed calling it in to command, but decided against it, partly because they didn't know how to report what they were seeing without sounding insane, and partly because the creature was moving away from their position and didn't appear to pose an immediate threat to their mission. However, the team leader did make note of the sighting in his personal journal, something he wasn't technically supposed to do, but which many soldiers do as a way of maintaining their own record of significant events. When this soldier eventually separated from the military and began researching whether others had seen similar things in Afghanistan, he was astonished to discover the Kandahar story and numerous other reports that matched his own experience. Another compelling testimony came from a senior unmanned aerial vehicle operator, essentially a drone pilot, who was deployed to northern Afghanistan and was responsible for flying reconnaissance missions over remote areas. This operator, who also remains anonymous but whose military service and specialized training have been verified, described a surveillance mission that he was conducting over a remote valley far from any major population centers. The drone he was operating was equipped with high-resolution cameras capable of both daytime and thermal imaging. During this particular mission, he was flying a routine surveillance pattern over an area that had been identified as potentially harboring insurgent activity. As he guided the drone into a lower altitude to get a clearer view of the individuals around the fire, his camera revealed what he made immediately call over his supervising officer to verify what he was seeing. The individuals gathered around the fire were not normal-sized humans. Even accounting for the camera angle and the altitude of the drone, these figures were unmistakably enormous. The operator estimated their height at somewhere between 10 and 13 feet tall, with massive builds proportional to their height. There were 3 or 4 of these giants sitting around the fire, and the operator could see them engaging in apparently normal activities, gesturing to each other as if in conversation, tending the fire, and at one point, one of them stood up and walked a short distance away before returning to the group. What provided a perfect sense of scale was that the goats were visible grazing nearby. The operator knew the approximate size of goats, having observed countless herds during his time flying reconnaissance over Afghanistan. Compared to these giants, the goats looked like house cats. A full-grown goat that should stand 2 to 3 feet at the shoulder appeared tiny next to these enormous figures, providing undeniable visual evidence of just how large these creatures were. The operator recorded this footage, as was standard procedure for any surveillance mission. He and his supervising officer watched the scene for approximately 20 to 25 minutes, observing these giants as they went about what appeared to be ordinary activities. The creatures showed no signs of being aware they were being observed from above, which was not surprising given the altitude of the drone and its quiet electric motors. Eventually, as the mission parameters required them to continue their surveillance pattern over other areas, they moved the drone away from that valley. When they returned to the operations center after the mission ended, they were debriefed by intelligence officers. They showed the footage they had captured and described what they had seen. The intelligence officers viewed the footage with what the operator described as concerned interest, but said very little in response. The operator and his supervisor were told that the footage was classified and that they should not discuss the sighting with other personnel. The operator later attempted to locate the footage in the mission archives, but found that it had been removed. The official mission log for that date made no mention of the sighting. It was as if the entire encounter had been erased from the record. This pattern of observation followed by suppression and removal of evidence is consistent across multiple testimonies from different witnesses, suggesting a coordinated effort to keep information about these creatures from entering the official record or reaching the public. Yet another account came from an intelligence analyst who worked with full-motion video from various aerial reconnaissance assets in Afghanistan. This analyst's job was to review hours of surveillance footage, looking for patterns of enemy activity, identifying potential targets, and generally making sense of the enormous amount of video data collected every day by drones and other aircraft over Afghanistan. During one of his regular review sessions, he was examining footage from a drone flying over a remote village in one of the mountain valleys. The footage showed typical village life, people moving between buildings, animals in pens and wandering the streets, children playing. But as he watched, a figure emerged from one of the larger structures in the village, and the analyst immediately knew something was profoundly wrong with what he was seeing. The figure was enormous, standing approximately 8 to 9 feet tall at minimum, possibly even larger. The analyst could judge the height by comparing the figure to other people in the frame and to the doorways of the buildings. This giant had to duck significantly to exit the building, bending almost double to fit through a doorway that normal-sized humans were walking through upright. When standing next to regular villagers, the giant made them look like children, completely dwarfing them in both height and build. What was most striking about this footage, beyond the sheer size of the figure, was that the villagers appeared to be interacting with this giant in a completely normal, unremarkable way. There was no panic, no fear, no indication that this was anything unusual. People walked past the giant, some appeared to greet it or exchange words with it, and overall the interaction seemed routine. This suggested something even more significant than isolated monsters hiding in remote caves. It suggested that these giants, or at least some of them, were living among the human population in remote areas known to and accepted by the local villagers.
The analyst documented this sighting in his intelligence report and flagged the footage for further review by senior analysts. When he followed up a few days later to see what conclusion had been reached, he was told that the matter had been handled and that he should focus on his regular duties. The footage, like the drone operator's recording, disappeared from the accessible archives. These testimonies from military personnel are already compelling on their own, but they become even more significant when we consider them in the context of historical and religious texts that describe similar beings. The Bible, particularly the Old Testament, contains numerous references to giants that inhabited the ancient Middle East. These weren't just tall humans. They were described as a distinct race or races that were fundamentally different from normal humans. The earliest and most famous biblical reference to giants appears in Genesis chapter 6, which describes the Nephilim. The passage states that the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. This cryptic passage has been interpreted in various ways by biblical scholars, but many read it as describing a race of giants born from the union of divine or angelic beings with human women, creating a hybrid race that possessed characteristics of both origins. Later biblical passages refer to giants more explicitly and provide specific details about their physical characteristics. The Rephilites, also called Rephaim, were described as a race of giants that inhabited Canaan and the surrounding regions. When Moses sent spies into Canaan to scout the land, they returned with reports of giants so large that the spies felt like grasshoppers in comparison, a description that suggests beings of truly extraordinary size, possibly 10 to 15 feet tall or even larger. The most famous biblical giant is Goliath, the Philistine warrior who was killed by David in single combat. Different ancient manuscripts give slightly different measurements for Goliath's height, with most sources suggesting he stood between 9 and 10 feet tall. But Goliath wasn't described as unique or as a freak of nature. He came from Gath, a city known to be inhabited by giants, and he had brothers who were also described as being of enormous size. One of these brothers, or possibly another giant from Gath, is described in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 20. This passage provides detail that is particularly relevant to our discussion. And there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he also was born to the giant. This biblical giant had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
exactly matching the description of the Kandahar giant provided by modern military witnesses who claim to have encountered it in 2002, thousands of years and thousands of miles removed from ancient Gath. The specificity of this detail, polydactyly with 6 digits rather than 5, appearing in both ancient biblical texts and modern military testimonies from Afghanistan, is striking. Polydactyly does occur naturally in humans as a genetic mutation, appearing in approximately 1 in every 500 to 1,000 births. But it's typically just an extra digit that may not be fully functional, and it's extremely rare for it to appear in a consistent, apparently functional form across an entire population or race. The fact that this specific detail appears in multiple independent sources separated by thousands of years suggests either a remarkable coincidence or a connection between these ancient giants and the creatures reportedly seen in Afghanistan. Other biblical passages provide additional details about the giants' physical characteristics and behaviors. They were described as warriors, fierce and powerful in combat, which matches the aggressive behavior of the Kandahar giant. They inhabited mountainous regions and caves, which aligns perfectly with the cave-dwelling creatures reported in the mountains of Afghanistan. Some biblical texts suggest that the giants were viewed with fear and had to be driven out or destroyed, indicating a history of conflict between these giants and normal human populations, which would explain why they might have retreated to the most remote and inaccessible regions to avoid extinction. The biblical accounts also mention that giants existed not just in one location, but across a wide geographic area. They were reported in Canaan, Syria, Jordan, and various other parts of the ancient Near East. This geographic distribution suggests that if these creatures truly existed, they weren't confined to a single, isolated population, but rather represented a species or subspecies that had spread across a considerable range. Afghanistan, located at the eastern edge of this general region and connected to the Middle East through ancient trade routes and migration patterns, could have very plausibly been part of the range inhabited by these giants in ancient times. Beyond biblical texts, other ancient sources make reference to giants. Greek mythology speaks of the Titans and giants who warred against the gods. Norse mythology describes the Jotun, a race of giants who lived in Jotunheim and were in constant conflict with the gods and humans of Midgard. Hindu texts mention the Daityas and Danavas, races of powerful giants who opposed the gods. While these mythological accounts are obviously embellished with supernatural elements, the common thread across multiple cultures of stories about giant humanoids suggests that these myths might have originated from encounters with real creatures that ancient people struggled to understand and contextualize within their worldviews. Historical accounts from more recent centuries also contain intriguing references. When Alexander the Great's armies passed through the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan in 330 BCE, some historical sources mention strange encounters in the remote mountain regions. While these accounts are fragmentary and were written long after the events they describe, they speak of enormous men who lived in caves and attacked any who ventured into their territory. The historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, writing about Alexander's campaigns, mentions that the Macedonian army encountered wild men of great stature in the mountains, though he provides frustratingly few details. During the First Anglo-Afghan War in the 19th century, British soldiers wrote letters and journals describing their experiences in the brutal mountain warfare. Some of these accounts, which have only recently been examined by researchers looking for historical references to giants, contain passing mentions of local legends about mountain giants or devils that the Afghan tribesmen feared and avoided. British officers generally dismiss these as superstition, examples of the backwards beliefs of the native population. But a few accounts describe encounters with very large humanoid footprints in snow or mud in remote mountain passes, footprints that were far too large to have been made by any known animal or human. Soviet soldiers who fought in Afghanistan during their occupation from 1979 to 1989 also left accounts that have come to light in recent years as researchers have combed through Russian military archives and veterans' testimonies. Several Soviet veterans have described encounters with creatures they called almasti, or kuptar, terms used in Central Asian folklore to describe wild men or giants that live in the mountains. Some of these Soviet accounts describe sightings of enormous humanoid figures in remote regions, though in most cases these were distant observations that didn't result in direct contact. One particularly intriguing Soviet account describes a special forces unit that was sent to investigate the disappearance of a convoy in a remote mountain pass. According to this account, which has been reported by a Russian researcher who interviewed the veterans involved, the Special Forces team found the vehicles abandoned and signs of a violent struggle, but no bodies and no clear indication of what had attacked the convoy. Local Afghans who were questioned told the Soviet soldiers that the convoy had ventured into territory claimed by the Mountain Devils and that the soldiers had been taken. The Soviet team searched the area but found only some very large caves and what they described as enormous footprints in the mud near a stream. The incident was officially attributed to Mujahideen activity, but the veterans involved maintained that something else had been responsible. These historical accounts, while far less detailed and verifiable than the modern military testimonies, nevertheless establish a pattern. For centuries, possibly for millennia, there have been persistent reports from the mountains of Afghanistan and the surrounding regions of giant humanoid creatures that avoid contact with humans, but will attack if their territory is invaded or if they're threatened. This consistency across time and across different cultures and military forces, all operating in the same general region, is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence or collective delusion. Now, let's consider some of the scientific and anthropological questions raised by these accounts. If we entertain the possibility that these creatures actually exist, even as a thought experiment, we need to ask, what could they be? Where did they come from? How could they have remained hidden in the modern era of satellite surveillance, aerial photography, and extensive military operations?
One possibility is that these giants represent a relict population of an archaic human species that was thought to be extinct. We know from paleontology and archaeology that multiple species of hominids existed simultaneously for much of human prehistory. Homo sapiens, modern humans, coexisted with Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and possibly other hominid species until relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Neanderthals only went extinct approximately 40,000 years ago, and some populations may have survived even longer in isolated refugia. What if another branch of the hominid family tree, one characterized by exceptionally large size, survived in isolated mountain refuges? The fossil record for human evolution is extremely incomplete. We have found only a tiny fraction of the individuals who ever lived, and we're constantly discovering evidence of previously unknown hominid species. As recently as 2003, scientists discovered Homo floresiensis, the hobbit species, that stood only about 3.5 feet tall, living on an isolated island until as recently as 50,000 years ago. If a dwarf human species could survive in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years, why couldn't a giant species do the same? The fossil record does contain evidence of unusually large hominids. Gigantopithecus, which lived in Asia until approximately 100,000 years ago, was an enormous ape that stood up to 10 feet tall and weighed up to 1,200 pounds. While Gigantopithecus is generally thought to have been more ape-like than human-like, walking on all fours rather than upright, the existence of such a large primate in relatively recent prehistory demonstrates that the evolutionary potential for extreme size exists in the primate lineage. Some researchers have speculated about the possibility of a bipedal descendant of Gigantopithecus, or a parallel evolutionary line that developed large size in response to environmental pressures. The mountains of Afghanistan and the surrounding regions, including the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, represent some of the most extreme and isolated environments on Earth. In evolutionary biology, isolation combined with unique environmental pressures can lead to unusual adaptations. Island dwarfism and gigantism are well-documented phenomena where isolated populations evolve to be significantly smaller or larger than their mainland relatives. The six-fingered characteristic reported in both biblical accounts and modern sightings is particularly intriguing from a genetic standpoint. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra digits, is caused by genetic mutations that are relatively common in human populations, but are usually selected against because the extra digit is often non-functional or causes problems. However, if a population became isolated and the polydactyly mutation provided some advantage, or even if it was simply neutral and became fixed in the population through genetic drift, it could become a standard characteristic of that population. In fact, there are known cases of polydactyly becoming common in isolated human populations. The Amish population of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has a higher than normal incidence of polydactyly due to founder effects and genetic drift in their isolated community. If a small population of giant hominids became isolated in the mountains of Afghanistan thousands of years ago, and if some of the founding members carried genes for polydactyly, this trait could have become standard in that population, explaining why both ancient accounts and modern sightings report six-fingered giants rather than five-fingered ones. The red hair reported in several accounts is also interesting from an evolutionary perspective. Red hair in humans is caused by mutations in the MC1 gene and is most common in populations from northern Europe and Central Asia. Neanderthals are also thought to have had red or reddish hair based on genetic analysis of Neanderthal DNA recovered from fossils. If these Afghan giants are indeed a relict hominid species, red hair could indicate either a common ancestry with Neanderthals or an independent evolution of similar genes in an isolated population adapted to particular environmental conditions. But this raises the obvious question: how could a population of 10 to 13-foot-tall hominids survive undetected in the modern era? Afghanistan is remote, but it's not completely unexplored. Satellite imagery covers every inch of the country. Military operations over the past 4 decades have seen thousands of soldiers operating throughout the mountains. How could creatures this large remain hidden? The answer, surprisingly, might be that it's easier than we think. First, consider the sheer vastness and inaccessibility of the Afghan mountains. The Hindu Kush mountain range alone covers over 600 miles and contains thousands of valleys, many of which have never been thoroughly explored or even visited by outsiders. The cave systems in these mountains are extensive and largely unmapped. Some caves extend for miles underground, providing shelter that is invisible to aerial surveillance and satellite imagery. Second, consider the population size that would be necessary for a species to survive. Conservation biology tells us that a minimum viable population, the smallest number of individuals needed for a species to survive long-term without excessive inbreeding, is surprisingly small. Estimates vary depending on the species and circumstances, but numbers as low as 50 to 100 individuals can constitute a viable population if they're genetically diverse enough and if their environment provides adequate resources. A population of even a few hundred giants, if they were spread across thousands of square miles of mountainous terrain and lived primarily in caves, could easily avoid detection most of the time. Third, consider the behavior patterns that would allow them to remain hidden. If these creatures are intelligent enough to make tools like the spear described in the Kandahar incident, they're likely intelligent enough to deliberately avoid contact with humans. They may be primarily nocturnal or crepuscular, active during twilight hours when visibility is poor. They may have learned over centuries or millennia that contact with humans leads to conflict, and thus they hide whenever humans approach. The few encounters that have been reported generally occur when humans unexpectedly intrude into the giant's territory or when the giants are surprised or threatened. The fact that some accounts describe giants living peacefully near or even among remote village populations suggests that in some cases an accommodation has been reached. The villagers know the giants exist, the giants know the villagers exist, and they've established an understanding that allows them to coexist without conflict. This would explain the peculiar traditions mentioned earlier, such as leaving offerings of died animals in specific locations. These might be tribute or gifts meant to maintain peaceful relations with creatures that could easily destroy a small village if provoked, but that generally prefer to be left alone. From a dietary perspective, a creature 10 to 13 feet tall and weighing over 1,000 pounds would require substantial caloric intake, possibly 8 to 10,000 calories per day or more. The piles of bones found at the cave sites suggest that these giants are carnivorous, or at least omnivorous with a strong preference for meat. The mountains of Afghanistan support populations of wild goats, sheep, deer, and other game animals. The giants could sustain themselves by hunting these animals and occasionally, as the Kandahar incident suggests, by hunting humans who enter their territory. The evidence of cannibalism, or at least consumption of humans in the Kandahar incident, is disturbing but not necessarily surprising from an evolutionary or behavioral ecology perspective. Many predators are opportunists and will consume any protein source available to them. If the giants view humans as intruders or threats, killing and consuming them serves both defensive and nutritional purposes. However, the accounts suggesting peaceful coexistence with some villages indicate that the giants are capable of distinguishing between humans who pose no threat and those who invade their territory, suggesting a level of intelligence and behavioral flexibility that goes beyond simple predatory instincts. The use of tools, specifically the large wooden spear, provides further evidence of intelligence. Tool use was once thought to be unique to humans, but we now know that many animals use tools. However, the creation of a spear, even a simple wooden one, requires forward planning, manual dexterity, and understanding of how to modify natural materials to serve a purpose. The fact that the spear tip had been fire-hardened, as witnesses described, indicates even more sophisticated behavior. Fire-hardening wooden spear points is a technique that requires fire, which means the giants either have learned to make fire themselves or have access to it through interaction with humans.
Some researchers who have studied these accounts have suggested that the giants might have a culture, albeit a simple one. The fact that multiple giants were observed together around a campfire in the drone operator's account suggests social behavior. They weren't solitary creatures, but lived in groups, at least sometimes. This raises the possibility of family units, teaching of young, transmission of knowledge across generations, and other behaviors associated with intelligent social species. If these creatures do possess intelligence approaching or even equaling human intelligence, this raises profound ethical questions. If we're dealing with an intelligent species, what are our obligations toward them? If they're confirmed to exist, would they be protected as an endangered species? Would their remote mountain habitats become protected reserves? Or would they be hunted down as dangerous threats to human life? The fact that at least one American soldier was killed by a giant, and that the giants reportedly killed and consumed the first patrol in the Kandahar incident, would make it very difficult to argue for peaceful coexistence. The military and governmental response to these incidents, assuming the accounts are accurate, suggests that officials who are aware of the giants' existence have decided that the best policy is complete secrecy. The recovery operations, the NDAs, the removal of evidence, and the official denials all point to a coordinated suppression effort. But why? What would be the rationale for keeping the existence of these creatures secret? Several possibilities present themselves. First, confirming the existence of giants would raise impossible questions about how to protect military personnel operating in Afghanistan. How do you write rules of engagement for creatures that aren't supposed to exist? How do you train soldiers to deal with a threat that sounds like science fiction? Second, the public reaction would be unpredictable. Confirmation that creatures from biblical times or ancient legends are real would challenge fundamental assumptions about the world, about evolution, about religion,
and about what else might be hiding in unexplored corners of the planet. Third, there would be tremendous pressure from the scientific community to study these creatures, to capture specimens, to collect DNA samples, and to learn everything possible about them. This would inevitably lead to conflict. The giants would resist capture or study, likely violently. Military operations would be required to facilitate scientific research, turning what might be a small, isolated population into a war zone. The optics of the world's most powerful military waging war against a possibly endangered species of intelligent hominids would be disastrous. Fourth, other nations might become involved. If Afghanistan harbors a species of giant hominids, what about the neighboring countries with similar terrain? Pakistan, Tajikistan, and other nations in the region might claim the right to these creatures if they cross borders. International disputes could arise over who has jurisdiction or research rights. The entire situation would become a diplomatic nightmare. Fifth, and perhaps most significantly, confirming the existence of biblical giants would have profound implications for religious belief and interpretation. For believers in Abrahamic religions, it would confirm the literal truth of biblical passages that many modern theologians interpret metaphorically. For skeptics and secular scholars, it would require a fundamental reassessment of which ancient texts should be taken seriously as historical documents rather than mythology. The cultural and philosophical implications would reverberate through society in unpredictable ways. Given all these considerations, a decision to suppress all evidence and maintain official denial might seem like the path of least resistance from the perspective of military and governmental officials. Rather than opening Pandora's box and dealing with the consequences, it might seem easier to classify everything, threaten witnesses into silence, and hope that the problem remains contained in the remote mountains where it's been hiding for centuries or millennia. However, this policy of suppression, if it exists, faces increasing challenges in the modern era. The proliferation of surveillance technology means that more sightings are being recorded. Drone operators and analysts review thousands of hours of footage, and not all of it can be effectively controlled or suppressed. The Internet provides a platform for witnesses to share their stories initially anonymously, but with increasing willingness to attach their names and credentials to their accounts as they see others coming forward. The declassification of military documents over time may also eventually reveal the truth. Documents about operations in Afghanistan will eventually be declassified, typically after several decades. If reports about giant encounters exist in classified archives, they may become public someday. Freedom of Information Act requests, while currently being denied, create a paper trail of the government's refusal to provide information, which itself is evidence that something is being hidden. As more veterans separate from active duty and feel less constrained by military regulations and NDAs, the number of testimonies is likely to increase in coming years. The psychological burden of keeping such an extraordinary secret, combined with the reduced risk of prosecution once someone is no longer in the military, means that more witnesses may choose to come forward in coming years. The accumulation of consistent testimonies from multiple credible sources makes the story progressively harder to dismiss. What would it take to definitively prove or disprove the existence of these giants? Ideally, we would need physical evidence, a body, bones, clear photographs or video footage that can be authenticated, DNA samples or other material proof that can be subjected to scientific analysis. The military allegedly has such evidence, the body recovered from Kandahar and possibly others. But unless that evidence is made public, it does nothing to resolve the question for the rest of us. Short of official disclosure, other forms of evidence might surface. A civilian expedition into remote regions of Afghanistan might encounter these creatures or find evidence of their existence, such as footprints, hair samples, or abandoned tools. However, Afghanistan remains extremely dangerous for civilian researchers. Years of war have left the country littered with landmines and unexploded ordnance. The security situation remains unstable, and many regions are controlled by the Taliban or other groups that would not welcome foreign researchers. The same factors that have allowed the giants to remain hidden also make it extremely difficult for independent investigators to access the areas where they might be found. Satellite imagery analysis might eventually reveal evidence. While giants living in caves would be invisible to satellites, they must occasionally venture outside, and large humanoid figures might be visible in high-resolution imagery. However, the sheer volume of satellite data covering Afghanistan is enormous, and without knowing exactly where and when to look, finding evidence would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Additionally, the best and highest resolution satellite imagery is controlled by military and intelligence agencies that, if the suppression theory is correct, would have no interest in making such discoveries public. Environmental DNA analysis, or eDNA, might provide evidence without requiring direct contact with the giants. This technique involves collecting water or soil samples from an environment and extracting and analyzing DNA from skin cells, hair, feces, and other biological material that organisms leave behind. If researchers could access the regions where giants are reported to live and collect eDNA samples from streams, caves, or other areas, they might be able to detect the presence of an unknown hominid species. However, again, access to these remote and dangerous regions is extremely limited for civilian scientists. The testimony of local Afghan populations could provide additional evidence, but gathering this testimony faces numerous challenges. Many Afghans, particularly in remote rural areas, are understandably wary of outsiders asking questions. Years of war have made people suspicious and unwilling to share information with strangers who might be spies, soldiers, or journalists. Additionally, even if locals are willing to talk about the giants, their testimony would be dismissed by skeptics as folklore or superstition unless it was backed up by physical evidence. Some researchers have suggested that the withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan in 2021 might, paradoxically, make it easier for the giants to be documented. With fewer military operations in the mountains, the giants might venture out more frequently, increasing the chances of civilian encounters and documentation. However, the flip side is that the security situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated significantly, making it even more dangerous for researchers or documentary crews to work there.
The question of whether these giants actually exist or whether we're dealing with an elaborate collection of hoaxes, misidentifications, and military legends ultimately comes down to how we weigh different types of evidence. The testimonies we have are from sources that appear credible: trained military observers, people with specialized skills in using surveillance technology, individuals whose service records can be verified. These aren't random people making claims on the internet. They're veterans who served in Afghanistan and who are describing experiences that are consistent across multiple independent witnesses. The consistency of the descriptions is compelling. The height estimates cluster around a range of 8 to 13 feet. The red hair is mentioned in multiple accounts. The 6 fingers, possibly the most distinctive and unusual feature, appears in both modern testimonies and ancient biblical texts. The association with caves and remote mountains is universal. The aggressive behavior when territory is invaded, but possible peaceful coexistence when left alone, appears in multiple accounts. These consistent details across different witnesses who had no contact with each other suggest either a genuine phenomenon or an incredibly coordinated hoax. Against this, we have the complete absence of official acknowledgement or physical evidence available to the public.
The military's denial could be explained either by a cover-up or by the simple truth that these incidents never happened. The lack of clear photographs or video footage could be explained by suppression of evidence or by the fact that there's no evidence to suppress because the creatures don't exist. The absence of bones, DNA, or other physical proof available for scientific study could mean that such evidence is being hidden or that it never existed in the first place. Skeptics would point out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that testimony alone, no matter how consistent or apparently credible, is insufficient to prove the existence of a species that would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution and natural history. They would note that humans are prone to misperception, especially in stressful combat situations. A large person wearing bulky clothing, seen briefly in port lighting or through thermal imaging, might appear larger than they actually are. Bears standing on hind legs, while not 13 feet tall, can appear quite large and might be misidentified in the heat of combat. Group dynamics and the power of suggestion might cause multiple people to describe seeing the same thing, even if it wasn't objectively real. However, it's difficult to apply these skeptical explanations to all the accounts we've discussed. The Kandahar incident involved a prolonged close-range encounter in which multiple trained soldiers observed the creature for more than enough time to accurately assess what they were seeing. They shot it dozens of times and watched it fall. They saw its body up close. This wasn't a brief glimpse of something ambiguous in the distance. It was a sustained combat engagement at close range. Similarly, the drone operators and analysts who observed giants through high-resolution cameras for extended periods of time weren't dealing with brief, ambiguous sightings, but with sustained observation of clearly visible figures whose size could be accurately gauged by comparison with trees, buildings, animals, and normal-sized humans in the same frame. The bear explanation, which is often offered for alleged giant sightings, simply doesn't work for most of these accounts. Bears, even large ones, don't stand 10 to 13 feet tall. They don't have 6 fingers. They don't use tools. They don't sit around campfires. And trained soldiers who have seen bears before, which is virtually all soldiers who have served in Afghanistan where brown bears do exist, would not mistake a bear for a humanoid creature. So where does this leave us? After examining all the available evidence, the testimonies, the historical context, the biblical references, the scientific possibilities, and the various arguments for and against the existence of these creatures, what conclusion can we draw? The honest answer is that we don't have enough information to reach a definitive conclusion. The testimonies are compelling and consistent, but without physical evidence or official confirmation, they remain just that, testimonies. The witnesses appear credible, but credible people can be mistaken, or can be victims of elaborate hoaxes. The historical and biblical connections are intriguing, but ancient texts can't be taken as reliable natural history documents without corroboration. What we can say is that something unusual has been reported by multiple apparently credible witnesses in the mountains of Afghanistan. Whether that something is a remnant population of giant hominids, some other unknown creature, a series of misidentifications of known animals, or unusually large humans, or an elaborate hoax, remains uncertain. The truth, whatever it is, remains hidden in those remote mountains, guarded by terrain that has defeated empires and by a wall of official secrecy that shows no signs of crumbling. For those who find these testimonies compelling, the Giant of Kandahar and related accounts represent one of the most significant discoveries in anthropology and natural history, a discovery that has been suppressed by military and governmental authorities for reasons ranging from practical concerns about personnel safety to deeper anxieties about how such a revelation would impact society's understanding of human history and our place in the natural world. For skeptics, these accounts represent a modern myth, a collection of combat legends, misidentifications, and possibly deliberate fabrications that have been amplified by the internet and by the human tendency to believe in the mysterious and unexplained. They would argue that if giant hominids existed in Afghanistan, we would have definitive proof by now, and the absence of such proof is itself proof of absence. The truth, as it often does, may lie somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps some of these accounts are accurate and others are misidentifications or exaggerations. Perhaps the creatures exist but are far rarer than the testimonies suggest, with only a handful of individuals surviving in the most remote areas, making encounters exceedingly rare. Perhaps they existed in the past, but are now extinct, with the few modern sightings being the last remnants of a dying species. What remains undeniable is that the mountains of Afghanistan guard secrets. These peaks and valleys have witnessed millennia of human history, from the passage of Alexander's armies to the Soviet invasion to the American-led coalition operations. They have sheltered resistance fighters, hidden treasure, and preserved fragments of ancient civilizations. Whether they also shelter a race of giants, creatures that walked out of the pages of biblical texts into the gun sights of modern soldiers, remains one of the great mysteries of our time. As we close this examination of the giant of Kandahar and the related testimonies from Afghanistan, we're left with more questions than answers, which is perhaps appropriate for a mystery of this magnitude. If these creatures exist, what is our responsibility toward them? Should they be studied, protected, or eliminated as threats? If they don't exist, what explains the remarkable consistency of these accounts from multiple, independent, credible witnesses? And regardless of whether they exist, what does the military know that they're not telling us, and why have they chosen a policy of denial and suppression rather than transparency? These are questions that deserve answers, but those answers may not come for years or even decades. In the meantime, the testimonies stand as remarkable accounts from the front lines of a conflict that was far stranger and more complex than most people realize. Whether you believe these stories or dismiss them as modern folklore, they remind us that the world still holds mysteries, that there are still unexplored corners where the unknown might lurk, and that sometimes the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we might think. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most extraordinary and controversial stories to emerge from the war in Afghanistan. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe these testimonies from military personnel? Do you think the government is suppressing evidence of giant humanoids? Or do you think there are more mundane explanations for these accounts? Have you heard other similar stories from veterans or from people who've traveled in remote regions? Let me know your perspective, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into mysteries, unexplained phenomena, and the strange corners of our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember that reality might be far stranger than we've been told.